Right. Hello, YouTube VOD watchers, and welcome to Relationship Q&A Round 2. We had such a great supporting... We had a lot of... Jeez, let me try that again. We had a lot of support for the first round, and people seemed to really take well to it. We had a bunch of questions. We had a lot of follow-ups. So we decided that we were going to do a second one. And who knows, maybe at some point we'll do a third one. We're doing these as a series, so we will have other topics that Jared and I cover. I really appreciate you taking the time to watch the VOD. I do want to make sure that I say here at the outset, before I hand it off to Jared to host, that this Q&A is designed for informational purposes only. It is not to diagnose anything. It is not to push you to make a certain decision about anything in any of your relationships. If you choose to take anything from this video and apply it to your own life, you do that at your own risk, because I can't assess anybody in here to be able to help make the right decision for you. So just please know that at the outset. I do hope that you learned something from this Q&A. I hope you did from the first one as well. Me and Jared really enjoy doing this, and we will continue doing them for as long as they are supported in the way that they have been. So I welcome comments down below, and make sure you hop in our Discord if you ever want to participate in one of these and ask questions. We would love to have you there, and all the links that you need are down in the description. So Jared is my dear friend, who all of you probably know by now, but he can introduce himself to whatever extent he would like, and then he is going to be the one that moderates this. So let's roll, baby.
Hello. I'm going to treat this as if this is y'all's first time here. So I am Jared. You can call me Jared. Online, I go by JareOnAir. And while I am also a friend of Ryan's, I am also what I like to describe a therapist-ish. I have a master's degree in couples and family therapy, and I actually met Ryan in a PhD program for human and family development, where he went on to finish it and become Dr. Mick. And I quit after a year because I decided that a doctorate was not something that I needed in my life. I am not currently practicing, which is why the ish is on there, which is another reason why I think I'm just a good moderator for something like this, because I know what I'm doing, I just don't do it.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah, I know what I'm doing, just don't do it. But I love these, very excited to do these. Definitely head of the Discord and ask questions, because that's where I pull. I don't think we'll make it to any chat questions, because we didn't last time, and I'm not even through the Discord questions right now, so there could even be a potential part 3 already. But I don't want you to think I'm ignoring you if you ask a question or anything like that. I'm just trying to get through the questions that have already been asked. But yeah, unless you got anything else, we can probably just...
I have one thing.
What's that?
In the spirit of, if people haven't seen us before, which I think is a good way to approach this. So I am a licensed marriage and family therapist in the states of Illinois and Nevada here in the United States. I have a PhD in human development. I am the co-founder alongside my wife, and I am also the president of Starline Therapy. We are a small group marriage and family therapy practice that operates out of Nevada, but we also serve clients in Illinois. And I have been a therapist for over 9.5 years at this point, so nearly 10 years. I maintain an active caseload of about 20 clients per week. I see couples, I see individuals, and one of my specialties is in working with relationships, including poly relationships, non-monogamous relationships. So I've had a lot of experience over the years in dealing with these issues. Anything that I say here in this Q&A is not my personal opinion. The things that, some of it might be my take on things, but I am pulling the information that I'm using to answer these questions from things like research, experience as a therapist, theory, and more. So I'm not just sitting here spewing Dr. Mick's opinion about things. These are informed opinions if they're like in the way that I answer them. So I wanted to make sure that I laid that foundation as well for anybody that's watching this. So all right.
Nice. I actually think that kind of gets us into a nice groove for the first question I'll throw up here. Let's see if this is gonna pop up.
Yep. I see it.
Did you see it?
Yep. Perfect.
Oh, there it goes. All right. I was waiting for the stream delay. All right. What is the difference between an open relationship and a poly relationship? Isn't an open relationship just shanks and cheating?
Oh man, what a good one to start with.
Mm-hmm.
Love it. Okay. This is a multi-part question, so it's going to have a multi-part answer. I'm going to pick the easiest part to start. Cheating has nothing to do with sex. It's just the most common manifestation of cheating. So I think it's important to first define what cheating is. Cheating is a violation of a rule or rules in a relationship, whether that rule is explicitly stated or implicitly assumed. So not all rules in relationships, for example, monogamy, is not always explicitly stated. Sometimes people just kind of assume that this is a monogamous relationship, but there is kind of a mutual agreement on the rules of that relationship. And anytime a person violates those rules, particularly if it's intentional, that's generally when we're going to consider it like cheating. We had a supervisor at Virginia Tech that used to call them extradyadic relationships, which I used to kind of laugh at, but I actually really like that terminology because it's a lot more all-encompassing than cheating. So important first for me to define that. I will first give a plug that if you want a really in-depth answer to this question, I do have a video on YouTube about polyamorous and non-monogamous relationships, and I encourage you to watch that video if you want more depth on what I'm about to describe. So there are two, I wish I could draw the square here, but there are, for simplistic purposes, there are monogamous relationships and there are poly relationships. A monogamous relationship is when there are two people who have decided that they are exclusive to each other in whatever way they define that exclusivity to be. Usually when we talk about monogamous relationships, we're talking about like sex is the most common manifestation of that, but there can be other things that are exclusive to the relationship depending on the relationship. A poly relationship is any relationship that involves more than two people. So it could be 3, it could be 7, it could be 10, it could be a mixture of that. Sometimes poly relationships are 2, and then they add a third, and then maybe there's a fourth, and then one drops out and it's 3 again. It is common for poly relationships to have what's called a primary relationship, which is either a dyad or a series of dyads, and then secondary relationships that are part of that, which can mean a whole host of different things, again, depending on the relationship. They're very complex. And then on another spectrum, we have open and closed relationships, and that is often referring to sex. That's going to be the easiest way for me to refer to this. So a closed relationship is when sex is defined as being within the bounds of the relationship structure that exists, whether monogamous or poly. Open suggests that people are free to seek sexual relationship with other folks that are outside the bounds of the relationship, but there's usually a set of rules that defines that opening. It's not just a willy-nilly thing. So you can have closed monogamous relationships, but you can also have closed poly relationships. You can have open monogamous relationships and open poly relationships. A common misconception about poly relationships is that they are open relationships. They are not unless they are defined as such. So even if you have 4 people in any configuration of primary and secondary, there are rules that bound that relationship structure to, and sometimes it's the point where the 4 of us are only allowed to engage with each other sexually in whatever way we have defined that. And that to go outside of that would be a violation of that, which means it's a closed poly relationship. An open poly relationship might allow for certain folks within that configuration to go out and explore outside of that relationship. So it's not, an open relationship is not sanctioned cheating because it follows the rules. So I'm going to give an example. It's a pretty generic example, but anybody who's worked with poly relationships probably has come across, well, or monogamous relationships has come across this at some point in their caseload, which is if you open a relationship, one of the most common rules, if there is a male identified person in that configuration, is that outside of the relationship, the male has to use condoms. And so you can have sex with whoever you want, as long as you tell me who it is ahead of time and you wear condoms. if a person goes out and has sex with somebody outside the relationship wearing a condom and they tell the person ahead of time, they have not cheated because they have operated within the rules of that relationship. Now, if that person goes out, maybe tells the person ahead of time, but then does not wear a condom when they engage sexually with the person outside of the relationship, that may be defined as cheating as it is defined within that relationship, because it's a rule violation, which is why I needed to define cheating first. So when we look at poly relationships or open relationships as cheating, that is usually a person using a very simplistic view of monogamous relationships and applying a overrepresented concept to something that they don't fully understand. Poly relationships in a lot of ways actually require, well, they do require better communication than monogamous relationships, more clear and direct communication, more clearly defined rules. There are a lot of aspects to poly relationships that monogamous relationships could actually learn from, because a lot of monogamous relationships consist of rules that are undefined or unstated, and people can violate those rules without even realizing it. Whereas in order to have a very functional and effective poly relationship, you really have to communicate your way through it. Same applies to mono, but people get away with not communicating in monogamous relationships a hell of a lot more often. So I hope that covers it. Again, if you want more depth on that, I encourage you to watch the additional video that I have on YouTube. It's a great question.
I have nothing to add. You covered all the bases there. Yeah. All right. I think we can easily move on to the next one here. Sorry, I'm getting reused to clearing out this chat slab room for stuff.
You're good.
All right. This is what I want. It is. The next question is, as a demisexual person, how do I navigate explaining to persons who show interest that jumping right in isn't something I'm capable of?
That sounds pretty good. I mean, honestly, sometimes the simplest explanation is the best explanation. Like, I think nobody should have to justify their sexual orientation to somebody else. So I don't think it's about a justification so much as it is an explanation of how you orient yourself to relationships. So if you have a person who is engaging with you that says, I really want to, I want to take this quickly. I want to become more intimate as fast as we can, or whatever it may be. And that could be at any speed. Any speed you define as too fast is too fast. You simply say to that person, hey, I'm not really interested or capable of going that fast. If you want to engage with me in this relationship, it's going to have to go slowly. And that's just how it is. And it sets a very clear boundary. It sets a very real expectation. And that person can make a decision of what they want to do with that information. I think it's important to realize that if your sexual orientation dictates that you must go slow, you do have to accept the consequences of that, which is that folks who want to go quickly may not be interested in you. In the same way that a person who wants to go quickly may have to accept that a person who wants to go slow may not be interested in them. So when we create extra, well, I don't want to say create rules, because sexuality is not something we necessarily create. Like when we have certain restrictions or things or affinities or things that appeal to us in relationships, or certain ways of orienting ourselves towards intimate relationships, it is okay to define those very clearly. We just have to understand that sometimes that has consequences in the form of a relationship not being sustainable. And you potentially limit your pool of partners by doing that. And that is not a bad thing. That's okay. And how you are in relationships is how you are. So I think sometimes there can be a tendency to kind of go into a space that a person is phobic of a certain sexual orientation because they don't consent to that type of configuration, and that's not necessarily the case. It's simply that there's a rule or a speed or a method to coupling or relating that just isn't sustainable for those two people, and it's okay to go your separate ways. But keep it as simple and clear as you can, and be open in communicating about that to the extent that you can be. And if that person's not open to it, it's probably not off to a good start anyway.
Yeah. I think the only thing that I would add is you kind of have to understand that there's going to be a certain amount of patience and frustration that goes along with this process, which is no different from trying to pursue any kind of relationship or any dating. But just being prepared for running into somebody that maybe you really, really like, but they are just not willing to go your speed, and you are just better off cutting your losses and moving on. Just being prepared for that frustration is a really big part of it, I'd say.
Yep.
Will help with the fatigue of dating for sure.
Absolutely. Another good one.
The second one is basically the second part of this question. Similar, but it's
You just pulled this on
how
your note.
might I explain to friends and family that being demisexual does not mean I am interested in each of my friends or only ever want to date my friends?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think you pulled the same question up on the screen. I don't know if you need to change that. It looks like the same one that was already asked, but there we go.
It might make me delete the other ones.
Okay, so I think so these questions are always interesting to me, and I want to acknowledge that different sexual orientations and relationship configurations have different types of like definitions and explanations that go along with them. And I also think that in this instance, like, the demisexual aspect of this question is not the important piece of this question. The important piece of this question is, how do I share something about myself with people who don't necessarily understand that thing that I'm sharing? And there's always an underlying statement in these types of questions, which is, I want the people around me to understand me, and I want them to accept the explanations that I have for things, right? That's why we communicate. We want to send information and have that information be received. The difficulty with communication in relationships is that the only thing you can control is how you share information. You can't control how that information is received by other people. You can tell people things, but you can't force them to understand it. And I think that one of the things that often is apparent in these questions is that you know exactly how to explain your sexuality to your family. The difficulty, perhaps, is that your family is not understanding what it is that you're saying or not accepting it. So that's not something you can control. You can try to clarify as much as possible, but there is, at times, folks have an unwillingness to open themselves up to new information, particularly if that information is dissonant to certain values that they have. And it's, at some point, it's not on you to have to educate everybody around you about how you are and how you orient yourself to relationships. So at some point, other people have to be willing to do some of the legwork if they care enough about you as a person. So I would say, take however it is that you would describe it and make that as clear as you can, and then say it directly to the people that you believe need to hear it, and then allow them to engage with you out of a space of curiosity. I do think it's important to also understand that when people are confronted is a harsh word, and I don't mean it that harshly, but like when people are brought new information that they haven't been exposed to before, their first reaction is often to be jolted by it and to in some ways be threatened by it, because there's a huge amount of uncertainty that comes along with that. And I think a bit of patience too with people who are actively making an effort to try to understand you and be curious about you can go a long way as well. So it sounds like you already know how to say what you want to say. It's just a matter of saying it and then responding to however they respond. And sometimes that's with boundaries, and sometimes that's with further conversation.
And if you are someone who doesn't know how they want to say what they want to say, therapy is a really good place to go to ask a therapist to help you craft that message for the people in your life that you want to share it with. You can also use friends for this, people that you have shared this with, or people that you trust, to try and kind of help you navigate your way around explaining it to people in a way that is authentic to you and how you say things.
Yep, 100%.
All right, let me see. I'm gonna try something different here. I'm gonna take that out. I'm gonna put this up. You go up there?
Yep. You're good.
Boom. I've been looking for a new relationship for a while, but one of the problems I face is everyone I've been on a date with or I've talked to on dating apps have all been sex first. Am I missing something? Why are so many people sex first when it comes to dating?
Oh man, this is one of those questions where relativity comes into account. Because let's say so you're on Tinder and you're in your town, and there are 500,000 people on Tinder in your local area, and the first 20 people you swipe right with and match with say that they are only interested in sex. That is a totally non-representative sample of the population, but it's going to feel like it's the only thing that's out there because you just happened to hit a streak of people that wanted the same thing at the outset. So one of the things that is, I think, I don't want to say problematic, but one of the things to be critical of in this question is the overgeneralization that everybody wants to have sex first when they're dating, because that's just not true. Now, sex is something for these people that maybe do want to have sex early on, that is really not any different than a person coming into a relationship and saying, I want to go slow. I'm looking for companionship. It's just the thing that's the priority for the person at the given point in time. If that's not something that you align with, you move on. And it's really as simple as that. In the same way that a person who's looking for sex who matches with somebody who wants a deep, intimate, long-term relationship could also do the same thing and say, no, sorry, that's not what I'm looking for, and move on. At different parts in people's lives, they want different things out of relationships. It's not wrong to be seeking sex, whether casual or consistent, or consistently casual. It's not wrong to seek a long-term intimate relationship. It's not wrong to seek a poly relationship or a throuple or whatever it is that you want to seek. The thing about dating apps is they can sometimes be demoralizing because you don't get the full picture of a person. You're literally swiping right on a couple pictures with a handful of characters. It's essentially like looking at somebody's Twitter profile and trying to make sense of who they are. It just doesn't work that way. So people put their first priority or their first two priorities first in dating profiles because they're trying to land people who match with them as quickly as they can. So again, if people want sex first, it means that they're not aligned with where you are currently and what you're seeking in a relationship, and that's totally okay. It's fine to say, hey, I appreciate that that's what you're looking for. That's not what I'm looking for right now. So I wish you the best in finding that. I'm going to move on. And that's totally fine to do. A lot of people struggle with doing that because they worry that they're being confrontational or they're being assholes in doing that. You're not. You're asserting your boundary. You also don't owe anybody on a dating profile anything. So sometimes people get desperate and they think about breaking their boundaries down because why don't I see if this sex first person is somebody that I should date because, I don't know, maybe it'll turn into something. You got to be careful with that kind of thing, because if a person's being very clear about what it is they're looking for on an app, you take that at face value. There's not really any reason to dig any deeper into that. So be careful about the overgeneralization. It's okay to be picky on dating apps. As I always say, the pickier you are, the longer you may have to wait. That's not necessarily a bad thing, because quality over quantity for a lot of people is preferable. And keep at it. It's sort of like applying for jobs. You have to apply for a lot of jobs usually before you'll get a call back from a job that's going to be meaningful to you. And dating apps are a lot like that. So
I have a few thoughts on this question. I'm curious to see your thoughts on them. I think the first thing is with, like, say, app dating in particular. It's a lot of people in one place, at one time that you're kind of taking in. So you're swiping through who knows how many profiles in, like a span of only 5 minutes. So you're already doing a lot of work in that regard. And that in itself can be kind of tiring and exhausting. And if you're doing that every single day, it is eventually going to wear on you. So one of the things that I think you should do is kind of prepare for what is essentially turn and burn. If you match with somebody, if they're asking you for sex first, and that's not what you want. You either just say, I'm not interested in this, thanks, and unmatch, or you honestly don't even say anything back if you're just too tired because it's a dating app. I think a lot of people understand that that's just kind of how the culture of dating apps work. Another thing that is more of kind of just like a way that I think about it is I think that certain apps have certain what's the word I want to use? Goals attached to them, if you will. Tinder, while it can work as a dating app, I think is a hookup app at its base. Yeah. So that is one where you are probably going to get to fatigue faster with something like this, because that is an app that people tend to use mostly for that. But when you get to apps like Hinge, or I would say I haven't had experience in this for 6 years, so I don't know. But I have a lot of friends who do use them, but like Hinge and say like Bumble, those are ones where you will tend to find people who are a little bit more relationship centric. So that is something that you might want to look at. There are a bunch of other smaller apps. There's also a lot of like femme-centered apps, specifically where they give femme identifying people more power in the situation. And those might be ones to explore for people who identify as that.
There's also no shame in like Match.com.
Like, yeah, I mean,
there's
yeah,
really
there's
not.
Faithfuls, yeah.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
sometimes people get
goofy.
I don't know if that still exists.
People get goofy about those, but there's nothing wrong with them.
Coffee bagel? I forget what that one is. But yeah, I mean, just the kind of fatigue that you're gonna get with dating apps is something that I think you kind of just have to, in some ways, embrace. And if you get too tired, turn the apps off. There's nothing wrong with deleting that app from your phone for a little while, coming back to it later. I think that's actually really good at times, especially if you find yourself matching with like the same people. Maybe it's time to just, pop that thing off. The other thing you can do is, if you are running into this problem, is either go through your settings and see kind of how they're set, play with those a little bit, play with your distance, play with the age, play with whatever other things are on there, because again, I haven't used an app in so long. And the third thing I'll say, which I'm actually interested in what you have to say about this, if you have friends that you are comfortable sharing your profile with, I would show it to them and talk about what that profile looks like to them. Like, when they see your profile, what do they think? What are the thoughts that they come up with? Because I think one thing that a lot of people run into is they might post certain pictures, or they might have like certain descriptions up there, and because of the way that the culture works, the things that they are putting up there are giving off a certain vibe that they don't want. And so having a little bit of tailoring of your profile could naturally get those people out of your matches really easily, because you're also naturally just going to match with people who literally go there and just swipe right on everything that comes up at 2 a.m. in the morning, and then you match with them the next day, because that's just part of the culture. Dating apps are just absolutely fascinating, but they are also extremely, extremely tiring. So it helps to have people navigate that process with you.
I would agree with what you just said. I don't know that I have much to add to that specifically beyond, I do think I'm going to tie together two of the things that you said, which is the less you have to put on a profile, the more surface level your engagements are likely to be. So when you, like, Tinder is 5 photos and a paragraph. Match.com is 10 photos and a full profile where you meaningfully answer questions. So if you want more depth, you want to seek out apps that allow you to create an image that mirrors that depth. Because, like, if I'm looking at a friend's Tinder profile, you might ask, like, what are you trying to get? But a Tinder profile is essentially designed to be a quick, am I attracted to you? Are we cool off of just a tiny little bit here? So it's inherently surface level what you're connecting on. Whereas if you do Match.com, eHarmony, something like that, none of which sponsor this stream, by the way, if you do any of those, the depth of matchmaking is going to be a lot more up your alley. And that's why I say there's really no shame in using those apps if that's what you're looking for. People get so ashamed of the idea of using online profiles like that. And I'm here to tell you, that shit's here to stay. Like, digital dating is here to stay. The 1970s version of dating is just not a thing that is going to be the primary anymore. We live in a digital world. That's how people date. It's a lot easier. It does funnel out some of the difficulty of dating. So go with whatever profile matches the depth that you're trying to put out there.
I'd still say don't give up on that Trader Joe's meat cute, though. It can still happen.
It's true. Agreed.
You know, maybe you both reach for a pomegranate at the same time.
Or that microwavable brown rice. Stuff's the bomb.
Yeah, it's good stuff. It's
or
good
the
stuff.
mochi.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right. I don't have anything else on dating apps.
No, I mean, dating apps is honestly a topic that you could talk about for hours. So I think we can leave it at that.
Next one. You're going to see here in a second. Growth is not something that happens overnight, especially in regards to trauma. What are some tips to be more patient with growth?
Ooh, I didn't see this one before we did this, and this one requires a bit of thought on my end.
Well, that's what we're here for.
Because there's a lot of, like, DrMick wants to ask follow-ups on this question before he answers it. Okay, so I think really the core question that's being asked here is tips for patience. And because, so one thing about it, spontaneous development essentially never happens. However, what's kind of interesting is trauma can actually be one of the few instances where there is spontaneous development. That's a conversation for a different day. But as far as patience for growth, when I hear patience, I often think distress tolerance. If you want to learn more about distress tolerance, I got a video on YouTube about that. Distress tolerance is a person's ability to be uncomfortable for a prolonged amount of time and act within that discomfort. If you have low distress tolerance, you are likely to bail out of discomfort more quickly. If you have high distress tolerance, you can actually hang with discomfort too long. I think about it as being like in a burning building. If you have low distress tolerance, you're going to bail when you see a spark in the kitchen, and you're not going to be able to put out a fire that you might have been able to put out, and all your belongings might be destroyed as a result. If you have too high of distress tolerance, you might get engulfed in the flames because you waited too long to leave the building. You have to have the optimal amount of distress tolerance to be able to hang in there long enough to attend to the fire, potentially realize the fire is not going to go out, grab a couple of your most cherished belongings, and get out. So there's an optimal range of distress tolerance. Because patience, like distress tolerance, can be bad if it goes on too long. Some people are so patient with things that they hang in there for such a long time that they realize they wasted a lot of time being patient. So growth is something that people have to actively participate in, particularly when we're talking about something like moving through trauma. And patience with that growth, I think, is an acknowledgement that it is hard, that it's probably going to take longer than you want it to, but also that you should have enough of an edge to want to potentially put the effort in that needs to be put in if it is something that you want to work through. So you can expedite growth through work. There is natural development, but you can augment and catalyze that development through the type of work you do. And therapy can be a really amazing place to do that. It's really, trauma is a really difficult thing because nobody asks for trauma, but the task of trauma is to pick up the pieces from it if you are subjected to it, should you want to do that. And it's not fair that you have to do that, but it is something that, it's what makes it unfair. It's what makes trauma so shitty. But it's also something that you have to decide that you want to work through whenever you're prepared to do that. And you go at your pace. Sometimes it's nice to get a little nudge. Sometimes you got to back it off. But patience really is having that distress tolerance for that process. The other thing that I will say about development is development comes with frustration, development comes with discomfort, development comes with change. And when people have a bit of an openness and a tolerance for the frustration and discomfort of change, they often will navigate it a lot more smoothly than folks who are averse to it. I think that's the best I can answer that without having more details about the foundation of that question.
I actually have a follow-up question for you because I'm curious how you feel about how I kind of conceptualize it. So whenever I hear the word patience, especially kind of in relation to questions like this, my brain always goes to, I think this person is asking, how do I be kinder to myself or kinder to others when navigating through these things?
I would agree depending on context, because I don't know that patience necessarily has to have a kindness component to it. I do think there's a such thing as like frustrated patience. I think we can be self-validating. I do think that it helps to be warm in our ways of responding and creating meaning out of what's going on for us. And I do believe in having a bit of that like grace for ourselves. I do think though that patience can have utility beyond like self-love. I think patience also can allow for things to progress. I think about things like, you know, if you plant a seed, you don't get jalapenos the next day. You have to nurture it, and sometimes being a gardener is immensely frustrating. And that patience can be its own reward when there's a byproduct, like when there's an end product that comes from the fact that patience catalyzed that. Because if you overwater, you can kill something when you're planting, right? Like if you're desperate for that thing to grow and you push it too hard, that can create problems. If you don't attend to it at all and you conceptualize it as patience, that can also be problematic. So I do think to an extent, like patience is really that allowance of whatever it is that's coming up for a person in the time that it takes for that growth to occur. And then also using that time to think about, how can I catalyze this if I would like to move it faster without destroying it in the process? So kindness, I think, is a component of it, but doesn't have to be there at all times.
Actually, you gave me another question. I'm particularly interested in the frustration aspect, and I guess, is there a way for someone to draw quote-unquote positives from the frustration in that process?
Yes. Literally, one of the core components of learning theory is that in order to learn, you have to be frustrated. So frustration is something that's unpleasant to experience, but you can channel frustration into motivation, which anybody who watches this channel knows I do not say that lightly. You can channel frustration into motivation. You can channel frustration, especially if you understand that frustration is part of learning. You can reframe it of, I'm potentially frustrated right now because there's an opportunity for me to learn, or there's an opportunity for me to grow. So there is frustration that goes in the direction of, I need to knock this off, and I need to stop, and I need to get away from this, for sure. I mean, certain interactions with folks can be frustrating. But I also think that, like, there's no good or bad emotion. There's just some that are a little more uncomfortable than others. And patience and allowing for that frustration can also allow for learning. Like, you literally, like, it's learning theory 101. You can't learn without frustration and anxiety. It's just how it is, because you're being introduced to a new concept. When a person has to process trauma and move through the aftermath of that, that's a new thing that a person has to explore. It's something that nobody really prepares for, and there's not really any way to prepare for it. Hence why it's trauma. So it's all part of learning, and I'm a big believer in like a learning and growth mindset just in general. So that's how I would answer that. Give me 1 second. I'm going to tuck Allie into bed. So I'm going to use this opportunity to say thanks for being here, friends. Appreciate it immensely, whether you're watching the VOD or whether you're here live. I'll be right back.
No sign of the millipede yet, but I'm checking a lot because I don't want that thing to pop up on me. I guess we didn't say that in the VOD, huh? If you see me, for those who are watching the VOD, if you see me looking off to the side a bunch, just because I saw a millipede earlier and I don't know where it is, it's probably important. Hey, Floaty. Sean could also cut this part out, actually, now that I think about it. Sean's kind of an editing genius.
Yeah, we just have to remind him to do that, because otherwise he'll just load it as is.
That'll be a problem.
Okay, I'll mark it. There you go, Sean. It's
I think
marked.
it's got to stay now.
All right.
I had a follow-up question actually for you because I think you're saying a lot of things that are really good and they are really easy to build off of. But you mentioned anxiety and frustration in regards to learning theory. Is anxiety always a negative?
No, Jesus. Honestly, I swear to God, if there was any one thing that I wish that I could just Thanos into the world, and I know that's probably a terrible. I don't watch Marvel, so I have no idea. Like, whatever. Who's somebody that could put things into everybody's mind? I don't know. Whatever. It's inconsequential to this. Just let me flounder here. If there was anything that I could have somebody put into everybody's mind, it would be that anxiety is not a bad thing. Anxiety is uncomfortable, but it's by design. Anxiety is useful. There is no such thing as a bad or a good emotion. Emotions just are. Anxiety is the brain's interpretation of some input from the environment that it perceives to be risky because it's uncertain, and so it creates a physiological response so that you are activated to do something about it. Whether it's to run away, whether it's to attack it, whether it's to freeze and observe, whatever it may be. Anxiety is also not a mental illness in and of itself. Something that drives me crazy all the time is when people say, I have anxiety, therefore I must have a disorder. No, you're just anxious. Anxiety is something that every human being on the planet experiences and is something that is totally useful from an evolutionary standpoint. Anxiety is all about getting in touch with it, acknowledging it, validating it, and then making decisions while it is present. That is how you can move through anxiety in a meaningful way. It's not comfortable. I don't want to be anxious any more than the next person does, but it's your brain telling you something. There are anxiety disorders. There are times where people's anxiety is so intense or so misplaced that it does fit the diagnostic criteria for disorder. But that's a very low percentage of people. So anxiety does not equal disorder in the same way that being distracted by something does not equal ADHD. In the same way that wanting things to be clean does not equal OCD. We have gotten into a place where we use disorders. I know I'm going on a bit of a tangent here, but we've gotten into a place where we use disorders as a way to try to legitimize an emotional experience we're having because people tend to be dismissive unless we do that. And using mental illness as a way to be hyperbolic about your experience to get legitimate attention from others is something that's starting to reinforce itself and is really problematic. So no, anxiety is not bad. I really wish I could get everybody on board with that. Humans decided it's bad.
I think it's a good tangent because I mean this is not going to be the last time we mention anxiety tonight. I guarantee it. I'm gonna push down this tangent just a little bit more because I'm curious. I'm curious about a therapist's response to this, but I've heard this before, and I'm curious. I'm sure you've heard it as well, but I want to know what goes through your mind as a therapist when you hear somebody say to you, "I've been diagnosed with anxiety." Just that phrase. That's it.
The immediate thing that goes through my mind is if you were diagnosed by a therapist, they either did a really shitty job describing to you what they diagnosed you as having, or you didn't listen to them when they told you what you're diagnosed with. Anxiety is not a diagnosis. Anxiety is an emotional experience. Generalized anxiety disorder is a diagnosis. So if an adjustment disorder with increased upticks in anxiety is a disorder, okay? Anxiety is an emotion. So if a person says, yeah, I was diagnosed with anxiety, you heard what you wanted to hear, or your therapist did a terrible job describing to you what they were actually diagnosing you with. That's where my brain goes, is we have to have a conversation about anxiety now, because that's not a diagnosis. Or you self-diagnosed it, in which case it's bullshit off the bat. You can be anxious without having a disorder. And the reason that I'm so passionate about this is because when everybody says, well, not everybody, but when a huge mass quantity of people who don't fit the criteria for a disorder say they have a disorder, it harms people who are legitimately diagnosable with that disorder. Because when folks like that, when folks who have the disorder go to seek accommodations and it's been overrepresented by people who misrepresent it, they're not taken as seriously. So if a person who is legitimately diagnosed with OCD goes and tries to seek accommodations from somebody, whether it's at school or whatever, and then that person has seen people saying, like, I'm so quirky, I have OCD, they're going to say, like, okay, what? So you like things to be clean? Like, come on, you can do it. Instead of taking it seriously that, like, OCD is something that legitimately destroys people's lives. So you hurt people when you do that. And also, I think all of us should be skeptical of anybody who appears to be glamorizing a mental illness that they have. Like that, if a person's like parading around with a badge of honor that they have chronic depression or OCD or whatever it is, that's a big red flag to me. Because nobody who has a mental illness wants to have a mental illness. I promise you that.
All right. I mean, I thought they were good questions. That's why I went down the rabbit hole. So,
no, that's fine.
You know, I'm glad you entertained them, and you know, I'm used to the passion. So it's nothing for me. We'll jump into a relationship specific question again. We'll get back on track here. I am in a long-term relationship and am currently in a position to move in with them. However, I find that I am no longer attracted to them or feel like I am in love with them. I feel like it would be best to break up, but I don't know how to break up with someone after a long-term relationship. Any tips?
It's super hard. It's going to feel terrible no matter what. There's never a right time to do it. I know I'm saying cliches, but these are true cliches. There is never a good time to do it, because if you're in a long-term relationship, it's going to hurt. It's going to suck. It's hard for people to be the one who end the relationship because they often believe they're being confrontational. It's also an unbalanced dynamic because you've had time to think about it. That other person has not. So you have them in a one-down position because now they're going to have to react to it as if they're being hit in the head by a 2x4, whereas you were able to build tolerance to the 2x4 by thinking about it over a prolonged period of time. The tips that I could give are related to how we should frame a breakup, and then I'll give some language about it. When you break up with somebody, you're doing them a favor. And I know that that's a really weird way to look at it, and I would say to somebody who's being broken up with that that person did you a favor. Because what you are saying to that person is that I can no longer consent to this relationship in the way that it has been defined. I am no longer able to reciprocate what you were expecting me to reciprocate in this relationship. That is an honorable thing to admit, and it is a respectful thing to share with somebody. And it's hard because it's not like when we're talking about a long-term relationship, you probably still care about the person. It's okay to care about the person and still end the relationship with them, because if you're not in it and you continue to stay in it, then you're really doing them a disservice. I don't really know anybody alive who would tell you that they would voluntarily go into a relationship where the person they're with isn't reciprocating how much they care about them. Like, I don't think any one of us aspires to have that. And that's the dynamic that's created when a person has made the decision to break up. So, as it relates to the language of it, first of all, and this is not specific advice to this person, but like, if you are going to move in with a person or add complexity to your relationship and you know you want to break up, you should break up before you add the complexity. It's really as simple as that. Like, if you can break up before you can move in, you should do it. If you can break up before you decide to have kids, you should do it. If you want to break up before you get married, you should do it. There's kind of an adage among therapists that all marriage does is make it harder to break up. Like, that's really the only thing that it does other than give you tax breaks. So the best time to break up, if you know you're going to break up, is now. So the language that you want to use for that, if you can, and I really wish this is something I could get people to know as well. Start with the end. Hey, I'm ending our relationship. And the reason you start with that is because they have to decide whether they want to hear anything that comes after that. What a lot of people do is they create this big giant speech, they make a big to-do, they do a bunch of qualifiers because they're trying to soften the blow. There is no amount of anything you are going to say or do that's going to soften the blow other than you being as clear and direct as you can be and as kind in saying it. So you should say first, hey, I know this is going to be hard to hear. I am open to talking about it if you want to, but I need to end the relationship. I have reasons for doing that. If you get to a point that you want to hear what those reasons are, I'm here to talk about it. I also understand if you need space, but I no longer want to be in this relationship. You don't even have to apologize. A lot of people say, I'm sorry. You don't have to apologize. It's okay. If you've reached the end of the line, you've reached the end of the line. But you can do that warmly and respectfully, and then you have to allow them to do whatever they're going to do after you say that, other than like abuse you. Like if that person needs to walk away and leave the environment, do not chase them. If that person needs to go stay at their mom's house, don't allow them to do it. If that person says, yeah, I would like to talk about it, talk about it. But when you end the relationship, you have disintegrated the tether, unless you have kids, in which case you damn well better be ready to put the effort in to be a good co-parent. But you have disintegrated the tether, and that person no longer owes you anything, and you at the very least owe it to them to be kind in the way that you deliver that message as best you can. So long as like that person, again, if you're like in an abusive relationship and there's like danger involved, then you should get friends involved, have an escape plan, that kind of thing. But if we're talking about kind of a standard relationship where it's long-term, it fizzled out, generally you're on good terms, you sit down, you be clear, you be direct, and you take accountability for your own anxiety as it relates to that. You cannot ask a person that you're breaking up with to reassure you for your discomfort and what it is to break up with them. That is super unfair. So have a friend ready on standby to call and talk to after you do it. Whatever, or you can leave this. You can leave the place if you need to leave. Hey, I'm gonna go because I need to take some time to kind of process that. I don't want to have put you in a position to have to reassure me for how shitty I feel about the fact that I did this. Whatever you need to do, but start with the end, and then work from there.
There's never a good time, but do you think there is a good place, like a physical location in which a conversation like this should be had?
I recommend doing it in a place where that person that you're breaking up with has ready accessibility to alternative support. You don't want to do it in a space where that person is isolated with you. You also don't want to do... I'm not a fan of doing it in public. I really think that that is unfair to a person because you have now put them in a potentially like not dangerous but really precarious situation if you're in public. Now granted, if it's something where you believe that that person may be volatile when you end it and that's part of your escape plan, public is a reasonable option. But if you're, again, if we're talking about a relationship where like you're in a good place, I generally believe that you should do it in a place where that person has access to alternative support and their own space to be able to go to if they need it. A place where you both can exit is really a big one because there's really like I can't imagine like breaking up with somebody while you're in the car driving home for 14 hours on a road trip because you've trapped that person with you after you just did emotional harm, so to speak. So make sure they have an escape plan available to them. I would also say, I saw somebody in chat said a therapist's office. That's not a terrible place to do it, but it also... Therapists can usually sniff that out. Sometimes you can tell when people drop their other significant other off at therapy. It's kind of shitty to do because it suggests to them that they need to have a therapist available to them when you break up with them, and that's not really a fair position to put them in. So I'm not a fan of taking somebody to therapy if you know you're going to break up with them. You should have the self-respect and respect for them enough to just do it. And then if you need to seek a therapist out after that, do it. If they need to talk to a therapist after it, they can take accountability and do that themselves.
I'm going to toss you a curveball here. If you are in couples therapy and you realize that the therapy is not working and that you no longer want to be in the relationship, is a therapy session a good place to bring that up?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Because at that point, because here's the thing, here's something that sometimes folks don't understand when they come in for couples therapy, is I am in service to the relationship. I am not in service to one or the other. I'm not there to be an advocate for the person who's being broken up with, nor am I there to be an advocate for the person who's doing the breaking up. So if we've been seeing each other for a few sessions or a prolonged period of time, and we get to a point where a person has come to that realization that this is not going to work moving forward, bringing that up in therapy is fine, because I have an established relationship with both parties and I can handle that relationally. Now, that may mean the end of couples therapy, and that's okay, but that's an appropriate place to do it. What's not appropriate is when you know you're going to break up with somebody and you come into a first session and you break up with them in session and say, all right, we're good. All right, I'll see you later. And then leave the person you just broke up with sitting on the couch looking at the therapist. That's shitty. Don't do that. It's also shitty to the therapist for you to do that.
I've actually never had that happen.
It's happened to me once.
I've had plenty of breakups through, long-term therapy, but I've never had anybody drop somebody off. That would be a first for me.
I've had people break up in the office, more in line with the question that you asked, but I have had a person dropped off to me before, and it's a terrible position for everybody involved. Mm-hmm. It really is. I don't envy any therapist in that position.
I'm gonna move on to the next one. Yeah, we'll go with this one. There's not really a good natural transition. I thought there might have been one. How do you suggest couples deal with frustrations arising from a difference in libido in a healthy manner, specifically without one partner feeling pressured by the other?
Oh, okay. Sex is the second hardest thing to talk about in therapy. First is money. Money is like way up here, and then sex is like here, and then there's like the rest of the stuff. Libido is tricky because, I'm going to back up for a second, and I'm going to talk about why sex is tricky to talk about. Because there's a consensual component to sex that is not really as present in a lot of other relationship dynamics. And that consent has to be taken into account when we're talking about a healthy sexual relationship. And so if a person is not in the mood, or has low libido, or is simply just not interested in sex, that's not something that we want to pathologize unless that person says that they also believe it's problematic. There's a difference between a person with low libido saying, I really hate that I have low libido, and a person who has low libido saying, like, yeah, I'm fine with it, but it's problematic for my relationship. Like, those are two very different scenarios. So when we have a difference in sex drive, probably the piece of advice that I give couples that need to talk about sex more than anything else is, do not talk about sex while you're horny. Like, if one person is in the mood to have sex, the person with the higher libido, that is the worst possible time to have a conversation about sex. Because there is a coercive component to that conversation at that point, because the person has an agenda that lies outside of the conversation, because that person wants to engage sexually. So you need to have conversations about sex when you're not in the mood to have sex. Those conversations are often uncomfortable because we do a terrible job in the United States teaching people how to talk about sex. Like a horrifically bad job. We talk about it as if it's something that's shameful. But if a person with higher libido is not wanting to pressure the other person, that shows a level of empathy and understanding for the position of the person who has lower libido. And so it's something that just needs to be talked about matter-of-factly. And I also think it's something that can be problem solved. There are times where a situation like this calls for a certified sex therapist, which, by the way, being certified as a sex therapist is one of the most difficult certificates to get as a therapist. It is unbelievably involved. So sex therapists, if you have a certified sex therapist, they know what they're doing. I promise. So you may need to seek a sex therapist who can help with some of the biological components of what's going on, or if there are psychological blockers. But really all sex is communication. So it comes down to, how do we problem solve this? How do we create a sense of we around this? How do we make sure that we don't look at the low libido person as the problem? Because that's usually how it's spun, is that we'd be better off if we had more sex. And that's not always the case. There are ways to problem solve that involve things that people kind of conventionally get squirmy about, like opening the relationship, or alternative ways of achieving sexual gratification, or whatever it may be. And sometimes that's a very useful intervention. Sometimes it's not. But there's a lot of communication that has to happen in there. And because there's so many contextual factors that go into libido, including biology, it's hard for me to answer the question beyond that without having specifics.
I think that's a great answer. The not engaging in the conversation while you are horny, I think, is something that most people don't really think about. And it's a really important one to highlight.
The amount of times, I think of so many couples relationships I've had in my 9.5 years where the conversation about sex came up when one person tried to initiate and the other person wasn't into it. Initiation is one of the most difficult parts of sex. It's one of the areas where a lot of people get hung up. And when one person is in the mood, or both are in the mood but aren't doing a good job communicating about it, having a conversation while you're horny. Because here's what folks, I think, need to understand about these things. I want to acknowledge folks who are asexual. I'm not really speaking to asexual folks here when I say this part. When we're talking about folks who are sexual, there is a deep, deep evolutionary drive that goes along with sex. And it is something that makes it a primal intensity at times as it relates to talking about it or being in a space where you are in the mood for sex. And that strong primal intensity of emotion makes it very difficult to engage your prefrontal cortex in a meaningful way. So that's part of why it is not a good idea to try to have these conversations at that point, because again, there's an alternative agenda there, which is I'm trying to engage sexually, or I'm trying to achieve orgasm, whatever it may be, and it immediately strips that conversation of the depth that it requires in order for people to be able to problem solve in a meaningful way. So that's why it's the number one piece of advice I give people. When you both are sitting in your frumpy pajamas, you have no interest in having sex at all, you're both tired from work, that's when you want to talk about your sexual relationship. Sometimes it makes you horny when you do that, sometimes it doesn't, but regardless, then you're prepared for the times when you do want to engage sexually. You can call back on the conversation you had while you weren't horny, and you can do way better.
Yeah, actually, with you saying that, the thing that came to my mind is, in that situation, I feel like when you are tired or frustrated from work, one of the things you turn to as a way of like distress tolerance might be sex.
Yep.
So that also could be something that you need to take into account and say, maybe this isn't the best time to have those conversations.
Sex is man, you know what? I think the number one, I'd be curious your thought on this. When I think of all the patterns I've seen in trying to help people have healthy conversations about sex, which I taught a human sexuality class, and I remember talking about this in that class at one point as well. Thought it just dropped out of my mind. I can't believe it just dropped out of my mind.
One of the most difficult things that it comes to when talking about sex, I guess you talked about it in your class,
yeah, there it is. Good. Nope, good. Is people are skittish about talking about their preferences. And we are so, as much as people think that the United States is this like highly sexualized place, which it is, but we're not highly sexualized in terms of like teaching people how to communicate about it effectively. And so we're often taught that talking about preference is coercive in and of itself, and it isn't. So things like fantasies, things that are things that turn you on, it can be so helpful to just say it. And a lot of times people worry that if they say it, so for example, if a person's like, I desperately want to try anal sex and I don't know if my partner is open to it. And they will not say it because they're worried they're going to make their partner uncomfortable. But it doesn't stop you from thinking about it. And so now you have something that you're policing boundaries on for somebody else, and you have no idea how they'll respond. And it's incredible if you can move people into a space where they say that out loud. You'd be surprised at how often a person might go, hi, I've thought about that too. And, oh! Right? Or there are times where a person might say, hey, I've really been thinking, like, I would love to try anal sex. And then the other person goes, that's not something I'm open to. In which case, okay, we've at least figured out how to talk about it. It's out in the open. Maybe it's something we have to problem solve. Maybe it was enough to be able to get that off your chest. So fantasies, turn-ons, all these things are so useful to talk about. And it is, it's not talked about enough. And again, when you're not horny, better time to do it. I'm going to add one piece of this, Jared, that I think is important from an attachment standpoint, because of course I have to sneak attachment into this.
Yep.
There is a real phenomenon that happens in relationships when people become securely attached, where they lose libido. And this never gets talked about. It drives me crazy that it never gets talked about, because I see it happen all the time. When people create really meaningful, secure attachments with their partner, that can sometimes desexualize that person in their mind. For a lot of people, sex is attachment acquisition, not attachment maintenance. And when you reach that point, it can sometimes, people will say things like, it feels like if I was to initiate sex with like my mom or my sister or like somebody, like a friend that I'm close to, and it doesn't feel right. Or if I'm into like dirty stuff, it feels like I'm objectifying somebody that I don't want to objectify. And that's a really profoundly difficult shift for a person to make sometimes. And so then that's sometimes when people will start to fantasize about having sex with other people, because it's objectified and it's not intimate. And people will freak out sometimes and wonder if that means that their relationship is on the fritz. And sometimes, no, it means your relationship's really secure. It means that you're actually doing pretty well emotionally. And now it's hard to objectify that person, because a lot of the sex that we have represented, particularly in the United States, is objectified. So it's a really precarious spot for people to be in, and that's when we start getting into having conversations where we have to kind of open it up and get into having some direct communication around this stuff, so that you can kind of rediscover some of that spark if it's there, or problem solve it if it's not.
This is something that you actually bring up a lot. I'm curious if you're going to pick up on it. What's something else that people do when they're in securely attached relationships? Do you know what I'm pointing to? You talk about it all the time.
Beyond what I just said?
I don't think you said it. I think you might have alluded to it.
Cheating?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, usually what we see is people who think about cheating in securely attached relationships, and then they freak out that they're thinking about cheating. And by the way, the number one way to stop people from cheating is to say you want to cheat. By the way, it helps a lot to name that you're thinking about cheating. People get really afraid of that. By the way, it's not cheating to say you want to cheat, and that's a hill I'm willing to die on. So yeah, I mean, people will here's the fascinating part about it, because the only reason sometimes that a person wants to cheat or thinks about and fantasizes about other people is because of the security of their relationship. So if you take that security away from the relationship, you will often find that all of a sudden sex is right back on the table. That all of a sudden that's the person that you so badly want to have sex with. And the process that I will see in these scenarios is maybe one person cheats, other person finds out, other person threatens the relationship because you cheated, and now all of a sudden that's the only person you want to have sex with is your partner. Boom, it's back, just like that. And it's because the relationship is threatened and there's not security there. So it's why I think being able to have healthy conversations in your relationship when you find yourself potentially fantasizing about other people can be immensely helpful, because you can see it as a reflection of security in your relationship. Not that you get to act on it necessarily, but it's a good thing for the person that you're with to know is going on, because you're going to fantasize whether you want to or not if that's happening. Better to have that be something that you can have a meaningful and healthy dialogue around in your relationship than something that you have to hide. So it gets glossed over all the damn time. And I really believe if I ever wrote a book, that's probably something I would write about if I was to ever write about a book, because I've never seen people talk about it, and it's such a pervasive thing for me. I see so many securely attached couples that think about cheating, and then they think that their relationship's supposed to end as a result of it, and it's not. It's normal, and I don't use that word lightly.
Yeah, you definitely talk about that a lot. I think it's one of the things that I think you talk about with me in regards to like therapy specifically, or just relationships, I guess, because we're not always talking about therapy. One of the things you talk about the most easily.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about it a lot at tech, I feel like, specifically. I think it was one of the first things I like kind of learned about you and your therapeutic approach.
Yep.
But yeah, I always like it when you point that out, because I agree with it.
The on a lot of people's faces when you explain that is pretty profound. It's very like relationship strength based as opposed to deficit based.
Mm-hmm. I'd also just reiterate that talking about your interest thing is super important. And also, I feel like it's always beneficial, because it gets it clears the table and lets you know, like, I guess, what's on the table and what's off the table. But I would say, how do I phrase this? It often works in your favor more than it doesn't.
Yes.
This is the way I'd put that, where let's use the example of anal, where you're like, oh man, I really want to try anal, but I don't think my partner wants to try anal. And then you tell your partner, hey, I want to try anal.
Lo and behold.
Like, I've also been thinking about that. And,
I've done anal with 5 of my partners in the past, and I've been waiting for you to bring it up. I didn't think you wanted to do it.
Oh man, yeah, that's another really big one, when you're afraid of like engaging in the same things you did in a past relationship with a new relationship, because you're worried about what the stigma is around those things. Oh, that happens so much.
Sure does.
Oh, that
sure does.
Oh, yeah, man.
Yep.
That's good stuff to get out of the way at the beginning, too.
I agree completely. Once you start to define your relationship as having a sexual component, you should just start talking about it. Like because you lay a beautiful foundation if you do that. Like if honestly, and it really, I'm not even kidding, because when you're dating, it's easy to have this conversation. You literally look at that person and go, what are you into? Like, and it's like fun, and it's like discovery with that person. People get threatened by discovery usually the longer they're in their relationships. And
they're worried that discovery will end the relationship.
Exactly. So you got nothing to lose in the beginning. You might as well put it all on the table. And man, you can have a fabulous sexual relationship for a long damn time if you do that.
Yeah.
Imagine for a second. So I see a question in chat that follows up with this, and it's a really important question, which is, I'm confused what talking about it does. Here's what it does. If a person says to the other, again, this is a conversation that happens while you're not horny, okay? Maybe even early on in your relationship. Let's say the sexiest thing that a person you're with could do is just start taking your clothes off randomly. Like that for you is just the most like profoundly sexy thing. Like you're just chilling in your living room, and like if your partner comes and just starts taking your clothes off, okay? If you tell that person that, it provides them an opportunity to do that. And it provides an opportunity for you to not have to ask for it in order for it to happen. So one of the really cool things about, because people will often say that it cheapens it if you have to ask for it. And that is, in some cases, a reality. So if you put it out there, you say, look, I'm just telling you, you ever rip my clothes off randomly? You've got my consent to do that? I'll tell you no if I'm not into it, but like, really love that. Okay, now imagine 3 weeks down the line, you've forgotten all about that conversation. You've had a pretty meaningful sexual relationship up to that point. You're chilling playing video games, and then your partner comes home from work and starts taking your clothes off. How fucking awesome is that, right? So, so again, why you talk about it is because then you know. Because otherwise, that person might have tried to initiate the way they want to be initiated with, which might turn you off. Let's say the other person says, oh man, a foot massage, that turns me on. But you hate your feet being touched. So if your partner doesn't know how to get you turned on, they walk in and they start massaging your feet because that's how they like to be initiated with. And then you're turned off. And now you have one person who wants to have sex. You probably would have wanted to have sex, but what they just did turned you off. And now you have an awful sequence of things that Jared and I have seen countless times in our job. So it's all about understanding what your person's into so that you can be cognizant of that and mindful of it when you're engaging with them sexually. It's an amazing thing when you can know exactly what your partner likes and do it without them having to explicitly ask for it in the moment.
And yeah, like you were saying, you could also just use it as a way of making sure the shit that you don't like doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Like, it's really easy.
If you know for sure that if a person does a certain thing, it's not going to work for you. It's not going to turn you on. It's good for them to know that so they don't do it.
Mm-hmm.
It saves them a lot of hassle too.
Huge proponent of talking about sexual desires. I think it's super important. I think it is also really, really difficult because of, like you were saying, the way that we have been taught how to talk about sex as Americans is horrendous, specifically if you are, you know, closer to the area in which I am. It can be scary. It can feel downright wrong and unnatural, if you will, depending on the language of your area. But it's important. If you're going to engage in a sexual relationship, it's important to talk about your wants, desires, fantasies, no-nos, maybes, maybe not now, need to know you more, all that stuff. It's important to have all that stuff on the table for your partner to know, because also you could save yourself a lot of time.
Yep. Yeah, the answer could just be, instead of no, the answer could be not yet.
Yeah, I'm thinking of specific things in which I have heard often in a relationship where people are like, I do not mind this thing, but I need to be at a certain point in our relationship before I am comfortable doing this thing with a person. So it's not a no, it's just a let's date for a little longer.
Yep.
And if you're willing to, you know, wait that time out, then guess what? You've got the thing that you want. And if you're not, that's also valid. And you can say, I kind of want it now. I'm going to move on.
Yep. What are you in? What do you like? What are you into? Great questions to ask. Nice and simple.
Yeah. That's why it's important to talk about it.
Yep.
All right. Is there a good segue here?
And we really we went off on that question. That was a good one. We didn't talk about sex too much on the last one, so it makes sense.
We didn't actually. Yeah. I talked about it a lot in grad school. I don't know if you did.
Not as much as we should have.
Not as much you should have. Okay.
Yeah, we had. My sex therapy class was atrociously bad. So.
Mine was too.
But sex was not something that I had one class where sex was talked about in like a meaningful way, and it was so early on in my program that it wasn't really applicable. We talked about sex way more at Virginia Tech than we did at Northwestern. Way more.
Really?
Yep. Yep.
My class was bad, but because it was bad, it led to a lot of really important and productive conversations. Because we pretty much every day I went into my sex class in grad school, it was going to be a fight about how the material was being taught to us and how we think it should be taught. And then that basically just led to a bunch of instructors in the class who were like, I actually have a lot of knowledge on this particular topic, and the way that you presented it is problematic because of X, and the right way to present it is this way. And it was like that for like a whole quarter, if you will. And also
we didn't have too much of that at Northwestern.
a lot of sex positive people in the community, where I would talk about it like my externship and stuff like that too. So I felt like I got a really good education there. One of which being literally the first time we talked about it, it was like, okay, how do you talk to somebody about sex in the room? And it was like, I guess you bring it up. And then they're like, okay, do you talk about this? And you're like, no. And they're like, why? I'm like, oh, I don't know, because it's like, I don't know, because it's uncouth. Oh, it's uncouth in the therapy room. Then where else would you talk about it? And every time you bring something up, like, I don't know if I'd feel comfortable bringing that up. Why? Why are you not comfortable bringing that up? Aren't you a therapist? And it's like, okay, yeah, no, this helps. This really helps.
This helps. Yep.
Yeah.